Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about how reducers look as code. We're going to start slowly replacing our contexts to reducers for the practice, and then we're going to really understand how we can use reducers inside of our context to improve upon what we already have. Sometimes it's an improvement, sometimes it's really just the equivalent of what we already have inside of context, but the key thing is that we want to understand reducers so we know their place inside of our ecosystem. To begin with, conceptually, reducers as code are very simple. They're pretty much just functions that return back an object. So here our const user reducer is just a function, and what it will do is give us back some object that has the shape of the data that we want to store. In our particular case with this object, we want to store anything related to the user. So for us, we already store current user, so we can just make sure that current user is a property that we also store and return inside of this object. So it could be null, it could be some object with whatever values. All of that is up to you. But for us, we know that our current user is either going to be null or that user object that we get back from Firebase. So for us, we know that that's what we'll want to store. And we want to make sure then that current user is on this object and that this object reflects whatever the actual current value is going to be. Nothing different so far. The thing about reducers is that these reducers change the object that we get back and the properties and the values inside them based on the action. But we also receive something else, which is the current state. So as I mentioned, reducers return back an object. This object is the state in the reducer. So what we get back is actually this current value from the reducer. And the reason why is sometimes you want to reference these values in order to derive what the next value should be. So the reducer gives that to you. And based off the state and the action is how we can determine, what type of object do we return? Or not what type, but what are the values on this object that we want to give back? And that's really all it is. Reducers are just these functions that always return a new object. And as we know, the reason why we always return a new object is because that is how React determines that something has changed. So if your reducer has changed, then this object must be different. Make sense? Okay, let's move forward. So how do we utilize these reducers inside of our context? Well, it turns out we actually get a use reducer hook. And the use reducer hook is very similar to useState. So let's start commenting this out so that we can start utilizing it. In order for this to work, remember, context still is context because the context is what values that we expose. The only difference now is that how we're storing current user is a little different. We're not using useState to store that value anymore. We're now using a reducer. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a reducer function. So I'm going to say user reducer is equal to a function that gets the state and the action, as I mentioned. And then it's going to return back some object. So let's figure that out. First things first, we know that on the action, there are only two possible properties. There's either a type, and then there's maybe an optional payload. So let's destructure those off the action. Now what we need to do is we need to conditionally return back an object with those values depending on the type. So let's talk about what kind of actions we have, because that's what the type represents. We know that we have some action that is set current user, because when we get set current user, what we want to do is we want to say, hey, I want you to give me back an object where the current user is equal to the payload. Because as I mentioned, the payload is going to store the value that is important for this reducer to know what to update this state value with. So if we're saying, hey, I want you to set current user, well, what am I going to set it to? Any information related to what to set that to is going to be in the payload or the payload itself. So here, what we can really think about is that, okay, we want to say based off this type, I want to return some object. And as I mentioned, there's some set current user. So what we'll use is what's known as a switch statement. Now, a switch statement is a special block of code where you pass the switch some value. We're passing type in this particular case, our type string. What it will do is then it'll say, okay, inside you can give me a bunch of different cases. A case being what you expect the value of what you pass me to be. So in our particular case, we can say, hey, if type is of the string set current user, then what I want you to do for me is run the code right here. And then you also have a default case, which is to say, hey, if none of these cases match the type value that I got, then run the default. So here inside of our case, we're going to say, hey, if the case is set current user, then what I want you to do is return for me current user, which is equal to the payload. So it's a new object. Return back this object, current user equals payload. So what about the default value here? Well, what we know is that reducer, this user reducer, should only be receiving types that it recognizes. If for some reason we get a type that doesn't match any of our case statements, then we need to throw an error. Because we need to tell our code somehow, hey, for some reason you gave me a type that I've never seen before. And we want to do this because this reducer should only be receiving actions with types that we recognize. Otherwise, it's some kind of silent error. So here I'm going to say, hey, there is an error of the unhandled type in the user reducer. So this will just help us track whenever we see something like this. Now, if you wanted to have more cases, we can definitely do so, but for now, we don't even have that many different cases to work with. This is enough for us. So what about this state object? What do we do with the state object? Sometimes you can use this state object to derive your next value. Like let's say, for example, you imagine we have some kind of increment counter. Let's say this just kept track, for example, of a number. And if you increment, and what you're keeping track of is some value that's equal to 0 or whatever integer. If you're increasing, then what you want to do is you probably want to increase the previous value by 1. So that's what you're setting the new value to. That's one case where the state might be valuable. Another is that on our state, we might actually have multiple values. So imagine if we have some state object where we have, yes, current user, which is equal to null, or some kind of Google auth object, right? We know that. But what if we were also keeping track of first name, which might be a string, and last name, which might be a string? All important values that are related to a user. Well, in this particular case, if these were values, if we're setting current user, probably first name, last name, we don't want to modify. So then we don't want these to be set in here somehow, right? So to do that, we're just going to say, okay, I want to spread through the previous state. And what this will do is this will spread in all of the current values for your object. Because remember, you're returning a new object and you want all of the previous values, except for the ones you modify. So what you're doing here is you're saying, hey, give me the same values on the previous state object that you had, but anything afterwards, I'm going to overwrite. And that's really what this is doing. So now, this is how we should always write our cases. Always return an object that spreads through the previous state and then just update the relevant values that you care about. And then the last thing that we need to do, which I've started up here, is we need to keep track of these variables, these string values. Because we don't want to rely on human error to remember what all these cases are. We want to keep these as some kind of constant that we can access. And I'm going to call this user action types. And this is just an object which has these key value pairs where it's the actual value. So I'm going to say set current user is equal to the string set current user. So now in order to use this, I'm just going to say, hey, if the case is equal to my user action types dot set current user. If this is the case, then do what you need to do. Now, how do we actually utilize our user reducer? To utilize it, we're just going to say, okay, I want to use the use reducer hook. This use reducer hook takes 2 arguments. The first one is our user reducer or some reducer. And then the second argument is the initial value for the state. In our particular case, our initial state is going to be an object, and current user is equal to null. Because when we initialize our application, we have no current user. And now, what do we get back from user reducer? Well, this gives us always two arguments. The first one is the state object. So the current values that's being stored by this reducer. The second is a dispatch function. This dispatch function, the way that it works, is that it's a function that whenever you call it, you pass it an action object. So if you want this user reducer to receive an action, you have to call dispatch, and dispatch will take that action and then pass it in, where it will then run through the switch statement and update the reducer accordingly. So just for our own sake, let's just modify what we have from useState over. So current user before was being stored on state. Now this is an object. State is a whole object. So we need to destructure off current user. So we can say const current user is equal to state, like this. We can also destructure directly right off the state, like this as well. Both are equally valid. And now our setCurrentUser function that we're also sharing from our context, now we need to define it. So we can say const setCurrentUser is equal to some function that gets a user value. This could be null, this could be the auth object, whatever. What we're going to do is that this function dispatches out a object which has the type of user action types.setCurrentUser, and then a payload value of the user. And this is what we need in order for this to work. Now, the main thing though about this user provider is that we still get some subscription value for the auth state changes from Firebase, and then once that happens, we call setCurrentUser like so. All of this will still work. It's just that instead of using useState, we're now using a reducer. So let's just get rid of these variables. And now let's save this. And just to make sure that everything's working, let's also console log out the current user. And just for safe measure, so we understand our reducer, let's also console log out the action. And here I'm also going to log a string that says dispatched. So now we know every time our user reducer runs, it's because we have called dispatch somewhere. So going back to our code, here what we see is when our app initializes, we get null, of course, because current user initializes with that null value for current user. And then because of our actual auth listener, what happens is that our user, because they're signed in, will get signed in because their auth state is being kept for us by Firebase. So then what happens is that it dispatches out a new action of setCurrentUser with the payload being the user object. And that's what we see here. Then our current user updates because useReducer as a hook knows, oh, my reducer value's updated. Because of this action type, I'm responding to setCurrentUser. I am then going to generate out a new state object. And then this useReducer hook is going to be like, oh, there's a new reducer value for this actual state object. Rerun this whole functional component, which in turn then dispatches out a current user update to all of the listeners that are hooked into this context. So this is the flow. It's very similar to useState. Whenever setState gets called, state gets updated, and the functional component reruns. With reducer, whenever dispatch gets called and a new state object is returned, then we also will rerun this functional component. So all of this is pretty much the same. And one quick thing I also want to do is I want to show you what happens if we run the incorrect type. So I'm just going to say this as a string of not handled type. If I save this now, again, we're going to go through the same flow, but we throw an error. So here we see an error that says that, hey, there's an unhandled type of not handled type in our user reducer. So exactly what we want to see, because we should never have code that will fire unhandled types. And that's it. Now our code is working. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, why did I include all of this boilerplate? Why did we write all this additional stuff when UseState was doing it so easily for us? It seems like this is much more convoluted. Now, again, as I mentioned, I just picked a simple user context for us to learn. And the reason for this, of course, is because there's so much here. We learned about action types. We learned about the reducer function. We learned about use reducer as a hook. We learned about dispatching actions. There's so many little things that we had to learn just to get this reducer working. So I wanted to pick the most basic example. And you're absolutely right. Most of the time for a context this simple, where we're just storing current user and one setter function, you don't want to use a reducer. You can just use useState perfectly fine. But the value of using reducers becomes more apparent in more complex cases, such as our cart context. And reducers have actually been proven to scale quite well when it comes to state management, hence the popularity of libraries like Redux. So my challenge to you is actually to take what you've learned in this video and try and modify the cart context yourself before moving on to the subsequent videos where we will do it together. And don't worry, reducers have a notorious reputation for being difficult to learn. For me, it was very difficult when I first picked it up as well. But again, I've seen the benefits and I've worked on numerous projects at massive scale in enterprise applications where it really proves itself to be incredibly useful. So it's a very, very valuable tool to learn and a very valuable pattern to understand. All of the pieces are there already. We've gone through it with our user reducer. It's up to you to see if you can figure out how to piece it together. And struggle is good. If it's challenging, you'll definitely learn little nuances in it while you're trying to convert the cart context over to utilizing reducers. So please try it. If any of this was challenging, rewatch this video, understand all these pieces. All of these interactions make sense between every one of these different parts that we've added. You just need to be able to put this flow together. So that's my challenge to you. Try it yourself and then join me in the next video where we will do it together. I'll see you soon.